The theme this semester, as you know, lectures by and about radical and progressive women. And today, Suzanne Wasserman is going to talk about a very radical and progressive woman, Janet Jagan, who I just learned was named one of the 15 most radical women of all time by the New York Times.
Time magazine, I think.
So our students saw a documentary about her last Thursday. We're going to watch a tiny bit today, but she's going to talk about it. Suzanne directed a documentary about Janet Jagan. She's a historian and award-winning filmmaker. She has a PhD in American history from New York University, and she's the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She lectures, writes, and consults about New York City history, especially the history of the Lower East Side. And she's published on the Great Depression, Jewish nostalgia, housing, restaurant culture, tourism, pushcart peddling, silent films, 19th century saloons, and 21st century street fairs. She's made a number of documentaries, in addition to Thunder in Guyana, which we're going to watch today. She made a documentary about Anna Yurskova, the immigrant writer, and she just finished a movie on New York City butchers called Meat Hooked. Yeah, maybe she can talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
But anyway, so she is going to begin.
So I'm going to show a couple of clips, but I wanted to just introduce a little bit the making of Thunder in Guyana. I began working on this project 15 years ago in the fall of 1997 when I learned that my cousin Janet Jagan, née Rosenberg, was going to run for the president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana in South America. Most Americans know little about the country of Guyana. Many think it is in Africa, and if they've heard of it, they only associate it with the tragedy at Jonestown. Few know that Guyana sits on the northern edge of South America, bordering the Atlantic Ocean. They don't know that it's the only English-speaking country in South America, or that it was a British colony until 1966, or that the majority of its inhabitants come from India and Africa. Guyana covers 83,000 square miles and is home to only about 700,000 people. I am a historian and a filmmaker, and I want to talk today about the relationship between history and film in the dissemination of untold stories about women. And my film tells both the complicated, little-known story of the country of Guyana in South America, as well as a family story. And my film is very rich, for those of you who've already seen it, I think you know, in issues of race and gender. Race and gender were really intertwined for Janet because she was a white American-born woman. So I'm going to start by showing a little clip, just the first 5 minutes of the film.
My mother loved to tell us stories about the characters in her family. The best one by far was about her cousin Janet, who in 1943 left Chicago for the South American colony of British Guyana. In the fall of 1997, Janet called to say that she was going to run for president of Guyana. What had happened to her during the intervening 54 years? I wondered if the Guyanese people would really elect a 77-year-old American-born Jewish woman for president. Janet grew up down the block from my mother in a typical middle-class Jewish neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. But Janet wasn't a typical Jewish girl.
My earliest memories of Janet is just being enraptured by her. She was very beautiful and very athletic. She always did so many different things. Horseback riding, swimming, nursing. She was swimming. She could have been in the Olympics in 1936 Olympics.
I used to take my allowance and spend it on flying lessons. And when my parents found out, they were very angry at me for flying without telling them and all that.
She was gorgeous, and she must have had all this adulation that anybody that beautiful would have. I know she had a lot of boyfriends when she was growing up. But I don't think it mattered to her.
This is my mother. 1914. She was a good-looking woman. She was a very handsome woman.
What was she like as a mother?
Oh, very good mother. Except on Saturdays when she played mahjong. Every Saturday afternoon, we couldn't do anything. Had to leave her alone with her friends. But no, she was a very good mother.
Her father changed his name from Rosenberg to Roberts to get work in sales or something because he was Jewish and he couldn't get a job.
I always remember the horror or shock. I think 3 or 4 of us were close, very close buddies. And once they started talking about Jews, and I couldn't believe it. I said, but I'm Jewish. And they said, what? And to show that, in other words, to be a Jew was something horrible.
Janet went to Wayne University, which was at that time a very radical university, and supposedly that's when she joined all the radical groups.
While at Wayne State University, Janet got involved in left-wing politics. Soon after that, she met a man who would change the course of her life, a Guyanese student of Indian descent named Janet Jagan.
We used to go to movies and things, talk, and he introduced me to his friends. I remember they had, at the University of Chicago, International House, I think it was called, and he took me there once or twice to dances. I remember that.
My uncle Adolf, who was very Republican, used to say, don't ever go to International House, it's filled with communists.
And as I say, we liked one another, and then she got married. Very much against my family's good wishes. They didn't like it at all.
Well, her parents were very upset about it. Very, very upset. Because they considered him black. I mean, it was a racist sort of a situation. It was shocking to them. It was a shocking thing she did.
Particularly my parents were dead against it. I suppose for many reasons. One, marrying a foreigner, marrying a person who wasn't white, marrying a person who wasn't Jewish.
My grandmother, I think she had a stroke from it, I don't know. And my other aunts who were conservative were afraid to talk to them. By that time, they were Marxists. They were both, Janet were Marxists. And so politically, they were afraid to talk to them. Racially, they were afraid to talk to them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them.
I actually knew Janet. I had met her on and off over the years. She wasn't allowed to come to the States in the beginning, but in the 70s she used to come. She and Chetty would never travel together because they assumed that one of them would be assassinated. There would be assassination attempts. So they never traveled together, but she used to come and stay with my mother, who was her first cousin. And Chetty also came and stayed with my family at various times when they were each in Chicago. So I knew her, but I knew her as this sort of, my mother's older first cousin. I was always fascinated with her, and I actually thought that someday I would do something. I didn't know if I would make a film or what, but I knew that this story was something that I always wanted to tell. And I was interested in the things that I pointed out in the film. In the beginning, I was interested in the fact that she was very beautiful, but she didn't seem to care about it. And her atypicality. She was very athletic. And also her rebellion against what was expected of her. I say it at one point in the film, when you see the houses in South Shore, that she grew up in a typical Jewish community. It actually wasn't. Her parents were very, very conservative, which was unlike most Jews in Chicago at the time. They were Republicans. And she grew up in an Irish Catholic community that then afterwards became more Jewish in South Shore. But her parents were Republicans, so they were really, really appalled by her attraction to Chetty and also to her attraction to Marxist politics and everything else. So as soon as she arrived in British Guyana, issues of race, gender, and nationality came to the foreground. I'm just gonna, let's see if I can figure this out. I'm gonna fast forward a little and I'm gonna play one more little clip. Let's see if I can do that. See that she says that they put her with the men and that upset a lot of relationships on the sugar plantations. But she was in Guyana for 54 years at this point in 1997. 64 by the time she died 10 years later. So her whole life was there, and she was Guyanese. She was allowed to operate in a man's world, I think, because she was white, which is interesting. Her whiteness gave her license that, in fact, Indian and black women didn't have at the time.
We were trying to organize domestic workers at that time. Workers used to invite us to their sugar estates to discuss their problems and get advice. I think Chetty was the first man from a sugar estate to become educated. And so they used to invite him all over because they were proud of him and they also wanted him to guide him.
When Comrade Janet came to Guyana, the servants then that was employed by the big shots was being paid 40 cents per week. And she said no, she made a protest. And she said they must be paid $1. Within that same week, everybody was fired. And they came to Janet and Janet said, no, you hold it. They can't do the work themselves. They will send for you. And within 2 weeks, everybody had their job at $1.
She arrived here in Guyana when it was not what it is today. We didn't have good roads. It was mud dams. And Janet, she plugged in that mud coming from a developed country. She could have said then, look, Chetty, I want to go back to America. She didn't.
Janet's political activities brought her to the attention of colonizers and colonized alike. A Time magazine reporter wrote, "Today, 6 years after her arrival, everybody is either for or against Janet. There is no middle ground."
Could you describe from where this, obviously it's an adopted home country, and this passion and commitment that you have to its people, where the seed for that came from? Is it shortly after? You don't know? any?
I don't know. Some of my strong feelings for those who who are living a hard life probably came from my own experience as a Jew in the United States. And so maybe that feeling of the underdog, maybe the core came from that, I'm not sure.
I hope that those of you who haven't seen it, I mean, it's a little weird because I'm playing clips, but I hope you're getting an idea of the film. So at the same time, Janet operated within the confines of expected roles for a wife of an Indian woman, of an Indian man. And I was interested in what role motherhood played in Janet's life and what role did Janet's marriage play as well. So I'm gonna play one more clip. Play and then fast forward. So she would define herself as a freedom fighter. I'm going to show one more short clip, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I made the film and why I made it and all of that. But let me just play it. Play. I want to go to
PPP's.
So, and then I'm going to end with when she was elected in '97. But I just wanted to say a little bit about why I made this film. I believe in the importance of archival presentation, but not every story is worthy of becoming a film. You must have an incredible story and access, and I luckily had both. I had incredible material to work with, and I showed you a little of it, but I had photos, letters, archival material, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about when I went to Guyana. I went with I had a pass from the New York Times. I was going to write an article for the New York Times Magazine. And so they paid for my trip, and I went down with an NYU film student. Her name is Deborah Granick. Have any of you seen Winter's Bone? Did any of you see the film Winter's Bone? This was like 10 years before she made Winter's Bone. She was a graduate student in the film department at NYU, and she came to Guyana with me. She's the one who taught me how to be a filmmaker. And my sister. So we were 3 white girls from New York, and we went down to Guyana, and we took and Janet was running, she was 77 years old, and she knew me, but she didn't really know me that well. I was kind of a remote relative. And she said, look, she wrote me a letter and she said, I'm happy to have you come down, but I'm really not going to have that much time for you. So, you can come down and you'll see what happens. We went down there and we basically were with her through the whole election. And she gave us complete access. I came back to New York and I had 20 hours of footage of the election, which was quite remarkable. And I found some of this archival footage, which is really from the BBC, and I just looked around because I was a historian. I knew how to find that archival footage. It was very, very expensive to license. It cost $2,500 a minute, so I could only use the very, very best material, which I tried to do. But when you see Janet and Chetty walking around Georgetown, I mean, that's incredible material to have. So I felt very lucky to have that, and then I came back and put together a sample reel and started raising money. And that's how I became a filmmaker. Now I'm finishing my 4th film. But it's, how do you tell a historical story and a family story? It's hard to do when you have a subject like Janet. She was reticent. You could tell. I mean, when I would say to her, what was it like when you met Chetty? She didn't say, oh my God, he was gorgeous and we fell madly in love. She was like, well, we liked each other. She was a political person, so she was very reticent about what she would talk about, which was understandable. And it's a complicated story. And also the relationship between the filmmaker and the subject is a complicated one. What happens when you're related to the subject of the story that you're telling? How does that affect the story you're trying to tell? Can you be objective? And I was very, very concerned about being objective. And is objectivity really the goal? I had complete lack of access to the opposition because the day after we got to Guyana, we were on the front page of the newspaper as Janet's introduced as her relatives. And I was hoping to have access to the opposition, but I didn't. Once people learned that I was related to her, even though I was kind of a first cousin once removed. I don't believe that anyone but me could have made this particular film because I had access to Janet. But there's certainly many, many other stories to tell. And I wanted to use Janet as sort of a hook to tell the story of Guyana in the second half of the 20th century from Janet's perspective, I think. And I think that I was able to do that. So I'm just going to show the final minutes of the film, and then I'm happy to answer questions and discuss.
9 months after Chetty's death, my cousin Janet, a 77-year-old Jewish woman from Chicago, ran for president of Guyana.
We have a lot of young people in our party. We have a youthful party, for that matter.
During the election campaign, the campaign was against my mom. It wasn't even against the party. It was more against her. It was all because her being white, her not being a Guyanese born. It was very vicious. They came out in the streets chanting. They held up these dolls, and the white dolls, and they were beating them.
Okay, good. Very hostile.
One of the questions is that she's not a born Guyanese, huh? But she's been there from the very beginning. I mean, she's put her neck out more than most Guyanese. And she's more Guyanese than most Guyanese you'll meet. She's more Guyanese than I am. That's for sure. The things that she'll put up with and make do with. I want some luxuries, but Janet isn't. Because she fell in love with his dad, and that was just, they just had the common goal. That's all they saw. They're meshed, huh?
With the vote still in dispute, Janet was declared the winner.
Victory was always anticipated, and here we have it.
We work hard. We deserve this. This is joy.
Yeah, for a second.
Congratulations.
We can get the team together.
What?
After your husband's death, is there any, you mentioned the tradition of carrying on, any doubt that you would...
Anyone?
Any doubt that you would continue?
Well, the party insisted that I be the candidate. It might sound immodest or something, but it's a fact.
Did you feel any reluctance?
Well, I sort of felt like I was walking into a prison of some sorts, because you see, you can't have the freedom. And this one ties you up a bit. Hello, Guyanese. Today is the beginning of yet another important day in the history of Guyana. Fellow Guyanese, let me say that I intend to be a president of all the people. Long live the people.
Janet's presidency did not go well. After 20 months in office, she suffered a heart attack and resigned. Guyanese are still locked in bitter racial conflict. Without her partner of 54 years, Janet carries on. At 82, she still goes to work at her party office every day.
So I hope you got an idea of at least Janet as a character. I didn't go into the whole story. I mean, obviously it's a 50-minute film about the racial politics in Guyana, which are very, very complicated. And that's a lot of what the film was about how that happened and who sort of, why it happened. And I can talk about that if you have questions or if you want to discuss anything. So I think I'll open it to you now if you have questions or comments. Well, I think she did earlier. Now, what happened was that Chetty was elected in 1953 when Guyana was still British Guyana. It was still a colony. So, but the British allowed them to hold elections, and they had general elections, and everybody voted. It was universal suffrage. Women, men, everyone voted, and he won. And so, but then the British came in. They got very upset when they realized that he had won, and they didn't let him govern, and they threw Janet and Chetty in prison separately in 1953. But then there were elections again in 1955 and 57, and he won again. So especially in the late 50s, Janet, she says, I don't know if I showed that part, but she says she was a minister of health housing, and I can't remember what, but she did accomplish a lot then. I don't think she did so much when she was president because there were so many difficulties going on then. So I don't know that she felt like she had accomplished a lot. When Chetty was reelected in 1992 after 28 years as the opposition leader, and there had been a very bad president in power whose name was Lyndon Burnham, who had started out with Chetty. And he was a US supported, he became a dictator. So in 1992, there were the first free and fair elections in 28 years, and Chetty was reelected. And that was a real period of, I think, blossoming in Guyana. But it's been a country with a lot of problems. It's the second poorest country in South America next to Haiti, I think. So they've had a lot of problems. Yes, they were upset because they thought he was a member of the Communist Party. You know, it was interesting being a radical in Guyana. You were at the end of the universe. Nobody even knew what was going on there. And they were really progressives. I don't know how he was interested in economic. You know, he was interested in the state running the sugar industry and things like that. But he was more conservative socially, I think. So, but the British freaked out. And then President Kennedy freaked out in 1961. When there were elections again, and instead they put into office, they made sure that their candidate got into office, Forbes Burnham, who turned into a dictator. So that was not a good situation. Forbes Burnham, he won in 61, I think.
He never won.
Backed by Kennedy.
Yeah, he was backed by Kennedy. Yeah. Well, they changed to proportional representation. So he never won the popular vote. That's true. Chetty still won the popular vote, but he won what was called proportional representation. And so he became president, and he stayed in power, and they had rigged elections. the elections in 68, 75, 86, they were all rigged. And until 1992, when Jimmy Carter came in, the Carter Center came in and said, let's have free elections here, and Chetty was reelected. And he was in his 70s. So that was quite an amazing, amazing time. And he died in office in 1997. He died in office, and that's when Janet decided that she would run for president in 1997. Well, she went to Guyana because she fell in love. I mean, that's really, I mean, Chetty was always going to go back. He was here first. He went to, his father worked in a sugar plantation, and he won a bet. He was a gambler, his father. He won a bet, and he raised money to send him to Howard University. Now, he was not allowed to go anywhere else because he was considered colored. Although he wasn't black, he was Indian. So he went as an undergraduate to Howard, and that's where Chetty was radicalized during the 30s. And then he went to dental school at Northwestern. And Janet was in nursing school at Cook County. And they met and they fell in love. And he said, look, I'm going back to British Guyana. And she said, I'll go with you. And that's how she ended up going back. And as my mother says, her uncle, Janet's father, said, oh, she'll be back in a year. She always does a million things. And she never went back. Well, that's a very interesting question. The question was did the hostilities continue? Well, sadly, Janet's father died in 1957 of cancer, and so he never met Chetty. He never even met him. My family was always very accepting, and so actually my mother remembers meeting Chetty. She thought he was going to be look like an Indian prince. She didn't know what to expect. But my parents were more progressive, and so they remember meeting Chetty, and they thought it was fine. Janet's mother did reconcile with her, and she ended up going down to Guyana after her grandson was born in 1950. So she went down a number of times, and they were very, very close, very reconciled. And she didn't come to Chicago very much, but her mother went down to Guyana, and everybody pretty much accepted their marriage. I mean, they were married for 54 years. Yeah, they did. Yes. Now, Chetty had appointed her as Minister of Housing and Health when he was president. She was also in the opposition party, and she was always very active politically. I don't think she was ever elected anything before her election in '97, but she was always involved in politics, and she was, involved in the People's Progressive Party that she and Chetty started in 1950. She was always very, very active politically, so she wasn't in the background. What happened in Guyana basically is that the United States tried to divide the races and did it sort of unconsciously. It sort of so the Guyanese are like 50% Afro-Guyanese and 50% Indo-Guyanese. There's a little bit more Indo-Guyanese, so if there's a popular election, the Indo-Guyanese are always going to win because they outnumber the Afro-Guyanese. It's very, very difficult racial politics still today. And yes, there was a discussion about Janet sort of carrying on the family legacy, and that was very Indian, like the Gandhis. She was compared to like Sonia Gandhi, and that she would get elected no matter what because she was identified with the Jagan family. And that is a problem. I mean, it was a problem, and I know that it's still very racially divided down there, and it's really a shame. I mean, it's something that I was very aware of, and I did talk about it in the film. I didn't highlight that today, but that is a big, big part of the story.
Even after she resigned and there was a new president,
yes,
the talk was always that she was the one who was telling the current president what to do.
Right.
So it was always that, they always thought that she was controlling the strings.
Right. Well, they said the same things about her with Chetty, that she was controlling his strings, which I thought was very interesting, and that was not true. I don't know about what happened later, but certainly in the 50s, Chetty was very much his own man, and she was not. At one point, there was a State Department memo that said something like, she's the brains behind the man, which is ridiculous because he was obviously very bright. So it was kind of a racist thing against Indians by the U.S. State Department. But anyway, Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and it's very, yeah, I mean, a lot of the film deals with that as well. Her husband, Chetty, wrote a book that was sort of a memoir called The West on Trial, where he tells the story of what happened, how he was kicked out of office, and what happened. It was published, I think, in the mid-'60s, in 67 or 68. But she never wrote a memoir. She never really, she's a very, very private person. And that was one thing that was hard about making the film, is how private she is. And I wanted her to tell more personal stories, and she simply wouldn't. What role did Guyana play in the Cold War? Well, really nothing, except that they were victims of the Cold War, because in 1953, which was the height of the Cold War, and Chetty was a left-wing, progressive Marxist, Britain decided to kick him out of office, even though he was democratically elected. So they were definitely victims of the Cold War. And Janet says, years later, she said, we could have done what South Africans did and asked for a Peace and Reconciliation Committee, but she said, we're just going to forget about it and go on and carry on. But there was a lot of damage that was done during the Cold War between Britain and the United States, and Guyana was kind of a pawn. Yeah, that's a good question. How did the Indians get to the Guyana in the first place? Well, there was slavery. The British brought slaves. That's how the Africans got to Guyana. And then when they outlawed slavery in 1838, then they started importing Indians from India, and a lot of them were taken illegally. They were just pressed onto ships. So that's when I think Chetty's grandparents came to Guyana, and they were brought to work the sugar plantations. And the Afro-Guyanese moved more to the cities, and they had more jobs, eventually in like civic jobs. But the Indo-Guyanese were the ones who worked the sugar plantations at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So that's how they got there, and it's interesting that it's such an even population mix. It's very similar in Trinidad and Jamaica a little bit. But in Trinidad is very, very similar population, Indians and Afro. The relationship between Guyana and Cuba is complicated and wasn't always good. They weren't always partners, And I don't know about young Guyanese going to Cuba. I know that there was a huge, huge exodus, a brain drain from Guyana in the 70s and 80s when the dictator was in power, when Forbes Burnham was in power. Like other places, Guyana considers itself, even though it's in South America, sort of part of the Caribbean, because it's more like Trinidad and Jamaica. So it's part of the Caribbean way, in fact, and they're also English speaking. But what was I just saying about, I just lost my train of thought. Yes, so I don't know about Guyanese going to Cuba, but a lot of them left. I mean, there's only 700,000 Guyanese in Guyana. It's a very sparsely populated country, and many of them are in New York City. They're in Queens and Brooklyn, in Toronto, in London. They're all over. I mean, the Guyanese are everywhere, and you often don't know that they're not Indian or Jamaican or whatever, because people don't know anything about Guyana. And it's a very difficult place right now. I know that they've had very, very hard economic times. So I know that it's a very, very difficult country.
We never knew her as Rosenberg, just as Janet. Right. But in Guyanese, I grew up calling her Auntie Janet. And I'm from a sugar factory, sugar plantation called Enmore, and if you've seen the film, you've noticed the Enmore martyrs in the late 1940s, just at the time of the formation of the PPP, the English had shot 5 of us from our village, and that kind of was the pivoting point of the People's Progressive Party, which started together as one party for the first time, that we had unity in Guyana. Now, just after slavery, the English had brought Portuguese and Chinese, right? And they died in the thousands. I think within the first 2 years, some 25,000 of them died. and then they brought us from India. So what they did, after they brought us from India, they brought enough people to create a complete divided society. Because they know the slaves were revolting, they brought us as indentured servants and kind of brought us in all those sugar plantations to replace the works of the rebelling slaves. So to begin with, the ex-slaves, the African population, were kind of disenfranchised to begin with because we came there as coolies to take their job as servants to the Englishman. But until when Janet arrived in 1943, it was the first time that we had unity in Guyana, where the blacks and the Indian came together and one common cause, and that was to get rid of the English. But then, as the story mentioned about the Cold War era, Guyana got caught because we wanted to take over. We didn't want to have any landlords in our own country anymore. So what we really wanted was kind of a Marxist kind of idealism where we wanted to take over all our state enterprises. And Roxanne mentioned the United Force, which was kind of a bourgeoisie party in Guyana. They kind of control all the elite business owners, which was the Coca-Cola company, the English company, which is called, it's a sugar company in England, and then you had the Dutch India company that brought all this. They were own all these people. So in the late 50s and then the formation of the PPP in 1950, we were very united. There was Forbes Burnham, as you saw, that became the dictator. He was of the PPP. He started the PPP with Janet Jagan together. So in the 1950s, during the Cold War era, we got sabotaged by, not to use those CIA words, but CIA came.
That's right.
Redivided the country, and they already had the Indians and blacks, and America was going through the civil rights era at that time. So they knew a lot how to play the racism game. So in the 50s and then the 60s, when they finally took Chetty out of power, now Janet was elected to the legislature of Georgia.
That's right. You're right. You're right.
In the 1950s.
You're right. She was.
She was elected as a council member in the Georgetown. But in the 60s, the plight again of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now our party, the PPP, was very, very sympathetic to Cuba, to the Russian movement, because we were getting support to kick the English and Americans out, because we did have an American English base in Guyana. So until after the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, then they weren't afraid anymore. And then they say, what else we can do? They sabotage the whole country. And now today, because of all of that, Guyana, the only country, has more people out of Guyana than in Guyana. It's the only country in the world that has more of its population abroad
living outside
than in Guyana.
That's right.
So today, from 1992, actually, we just celebrated final independence from England. It's not 1966 as most people would think, really, as they have it on paper, but it's really October 5th, 1992, which is just really 20 years ago that Guyana really got free from imperialist control. So just to bring everything in a nutshell as to what really happened in Guyana, we did get caught severely as a pawn in the Cold War era. And as far as our relationship with Cuba, we can boast in the Caribbean among the best healthcare system in the Western Hemisphere, although we're second poorest to Haiti. Guyana is the second poorest country to Haiti, but we don't even have malnutrition. And that's because we have Cuban support. And yes, we have had a lot of students in Cuba, not to get indoctrinated, but to get taught. And we had 1,000 students in Cuba, and we're finally bringing home 300 more of the last 1,200 batch are coming back to Guyana serving the medical. But Cuba played a really great role in the development and progressive ideals on what's happening in Guyana today. And if it wasn't for Cuba, Guyana would have been as Haiti.
Yeah.
So we want to thank the Cuban people and the Cuban government for supporting Guyana. And Janet, our mother of country, no woman, I don't know of any woman in the world like Janet.
Well, just that, Janet was really one of the only white women in the country in the 1950s, certainly. I mean, there was some Portuguese, there was some British, but not really. I mean, she was very involved in politics, and so she was a very, very unique person, a very unique figure, and they didn't really know what to do with her. You know, I mean, because it was a very divided gendered society. It was very, you know, the women would stay with the women in the kitchen and the men would be with the men, and they didn't know what to do with her. So she says they put her with the men. So does that, so I mean, it's hard to explain, but that's really, she was in a very, very unique position. Well, there were indigenous Taino people. I mean, there were indigenous people, but they had been basically wiped out. There are still some indigenous people in Guyana. Indians, you know.
9% of our population.
9% of the population.
Well, most of them have gotten killed by the Dutch when they first came.
Yes, yeah, they were really wiped out very, very early from disease and, you know, murder and all kinds of things. So, but there is still an indigenous population there, and they mostly live outside of the city. And, you know, I don't know how involved they are in politics, but it's 9% of the population. That's a good question.